The neon sign of Marty's diner flickered weakly in the night, casting a blurred glow onto the rain-soaked pavement like a memory slowly fading. Rachel Moore tightened her thin coat around her shoulders as she stepped out into the cold October air of Brooklyn. Her feet throbbed after 12 hours of standing, and the smell of grease mixed with the faint bitterness of exhaustion still clung to her apron like a second skin. At 2:17 in the morning, the 28-year-old woman, alone and drained, turned into the narrow alley behind the diner, the shortcut she walked every night after her shift. But that night, something made her stop. Beneath the dim streetlight, a man lay collapsed against a brick wall, like something discarded. His expensive suit, soaked through with rain, still held its firm shape, and his polished Italian shoes did not belong anywhere near this worn-down neighborhood. He was unconscious, his face turned to the side, his dark hair plastered to his forehead. Rachel hesitated. This area was no stranger to drunks or addicts. Stopping could mean trouble, but something about this man kept her from walking away. His posture, the cold silence around him, and the thin, thread-like breath escaping his chest made her heart clench. She knelt, calling softly. No response. When her trembling fingers slipped into the pocket of his coat, she expected nothing more than a wallet and a phone. But what she found chilled her to the bone, a genuine leather wallet stuffed with cash and a pitch-black business card. No company name, no address, only a single phone number pressed in gold, and one line of text, for emergency use only. She looked at the man again. A striking face, sun-warmed skin, a man perhaps only a few years older than she was, yet he looked as though he had stepped out of a different world entirely. He was fading in front of her, and she had no time for doubt. Her hand shook as she dialed the number. 1 ring, 2 rings. Who is this? The voice was deep, cold, authoritative enough to send a shiver down her spine. Only 3 simple words, yet enough for her to know this was not like any call she had ever made in her life. I found a man. He's unconscious. His name is Nicholas Romano, she stammered, her heart pounding in her chest. The silence stretched so long she thought the call had dropped. Then the voice returned, sharp as a blade. Where? It was not a question, it was a command. Rachel swallowed hard and answered quickly. In the alley next to Marty's diner, 79th Street in Brooklyn. He can barely breathe. Do not go anywhere. Do not call anyone else. Do not let anyone touch him. I'm on my way. The line went dead. Rachel stared at her phone, her breath thinning with fear. The man had not asked whether she had called an ambulance. He had not mentioned a hospital. He had only given orders, and she, for reasons she could not name, obeyed. Although every watch's rational part of her screamed to run, Rachel remained kneeling beside the stranger, pulling off her coat to lay over his chest to preserve the little warmth he had left. She pressed her fingers to his wrist, searching for the faint, faltering pulse. Hold on. Please don't die, she whispered, her words dissolving into the sound of rain, beating softly against the cold concrete. Then she heard engines, distant but growing. One vehicle, then another, then more. The heavy rumble vibrated through the empty streets like a warning. They were not ambulances, no sirens, no flashing lights. But the engines were steady, powerful, deliberate. Rachel turned, her eyes widening. Headlights swept across the alley, then stopped. Several figures in dark clothing stepped out, their movements quick and controlled. And at their center, a tall man with salt and pepper hair, a hard face, and eyes that seemed to pierce straight through the night, walked toward her. In that moment, Rachel knew that the instant those vehicles stopped, her life had been marked. The salt and pepper-haired man walked toward her with a slow, commanding stride, as if each step he placed on the ground was meant to claim territory. The men behind him fanned out, forming a silent barrier at the mouth of the alley. Every one of them wore impeccably tailored black clothing, broad-shouldered, alert, and Rachel did not need to look closely to know they were armed. She remained frozen where she knelt, her hand still resting lightly on the unconscious man's chest, as the only proof she meant no harm. The man stopped directly in front of her, his gray eyes sweeping over Rachel before settling on Nick's rain-soaked body. There was a tension in his gaze so sharp it felt like steel, yet his face betrayed nothing. Rachel felt a coldness wrap around her body that had nothing to do with the rain, but everything to do with the presence of the man standing before her. He did not ask who she was, did not ask what had happened. Instead, He lowered himself beside the fallen man, his large but controlled hands checking Nick's pulse, his breathing, then lifting an eyelid to test his pupil response. His expression did not change, but the tightening of his jaw revealed a fury being held back with immense effort. Rachel held her breath. Finally, he lifted his head and fixed his eyes on her, as if he could pull every thought from her mind without a single question. His voice, when it came, was low and rough, and he did not need to raise it to make her obey. "How long ago did you find him?" Rachel stammered. "About 20 minutes. He was already unconscious when I got here. I don't know what happened. I just saw him lying there." He looked at her for a long moment, then gave a slight nod and turned to the man nearest him, signaling with a single gesture. That man pulled out a small communication device and murmured something into it. The entire group moved like a machine coming to life. 2 men crouched down, lifting Nick with a care and precision that made him seem less like a man and more like something priceless. Another man opened the back of a vehicle, revealing not seats but a padded compartment lined with medical equipment. Rachel stared, stunned. She realized instantly that these were not ordinary people, and the man lying there was not some stranger who had simply collapsed on the street. She remembered the moment she found the black business card in his wallet. Everything had begun from that single second. When her fingertips brushed that smooth, weightless card, she had trembled, guided by a quiet instinct that this information did not belong to people like her. No name, no title, no company logo. Only a sequence of 10 embossed golden digits and one message, for emergency use only. She had stood there for a long time, her heart pounding, her hand shaking as she held her phone. She did not know what she was expecting. A police line? An assistant? A family member? But the voice that answered after 2 rings crushed every hope of that. It carried no worry, no concern, only a force that made her feel as if she had opened a door she would never be able to close again. "Who is this?" The weight of that voice thickened the air around her. It was not loud, not forceful, but something in the way he pronounced each word straightened her spine even though he was not standing there in front of her. She had tried to explain, telling him she was a stranger, that she had just found a man lying in the alley. She said his name, Nicholas Romano. And when she spoke that name aloud, something on the other end of the line shifted. The silence stretched so long she almost hung up, until his voice returned, lower, sharper. "Where?" She gave the address. He did not ask another question, did not wait for details. He spoke only 3 commands. "Do not leave. Do not call anyone else. Do not let anyone near him." Then the line went dead as if he had never existed at all, except for the heavy pressure that remained sitting in her chest. Now, with him standing before her in flesh and blood, Rachel understood one thing without question. The man was Vincent Romano. And that midnight phone call had pulled her into a world no one in this neighborhood would ever dare to meet eye to eye. The rain grew heavier as the vehicle doors slammed shut behind her, the sound echoing off the brick walls like cold drum beats warning that something irreversible was unfolding. The gray-eyed man, his presence as solid as forged iron, stood straight as he looked down at Nick, his gaze controlled and distant enough to make Rachel feel impossibly small, simply sharing the same space. No one spoke. No introductions were needed. Even though she had never seen him before, she knew this was the man she had called, the man who issued orders like a wartime commander, and she, without understanding why, had obeyed him completely. Vincent Romano. His eyes swept across her, again, lingering a fraction longer this time. It was not anger, not warmth, but the assessing gaze of someone accustomed to deciding who deserves to keep breathing. Rachel felt as if she were being examined under a microscope, each breath and heartbeat quietly measured. He did not ask who she was, did not ask why she was here. He simply turned back to his son. Nick was lifted into the back of the large SUV, where a middle-aged doctor was already waiting. The interior glowed with bright white light, outfitted with medical devices unlike anything Rachel had seen even in an emergency room. The doctor, the only person in the group wearing a white coat, leaned over Nick, checking his pupils, drawing blood, starting fluids, all without a word. Rachel stepped back, both to stay out of the way and to steady herself, trying to accept what she was seeing. Part of her still could not believe any of this was real. She had just finished her night shift. She had only meant to take a shortcut home. Instead, she now stood among men who looked like they had walked out of a Mafia film, in front of a man who felt like the real thing. watching his son receive treatment more advanced than anything available in a public hospital. A sharp gust of wind swept through the alley, carrying the sterile scent of medical supplies from the SUV and the faint smell of gunpowder from the clothes of the men surrounding her. Rachel glanced around. No one else was there. The whole neighborhood felt as if it were holding its breath. Windows dark, no curious faces, not even a barking dog. As though everyone already knew better than to witness what was happening. One man, perhaps the closest aide, approached Vincent and whispered something. She could not hear the words, but she saw Vincent nod once, barely noticeable, then turn toward her. When he spoke, his voice was not loud, yet it pressed the air flat around them. "When did you find him?" Rachel steadied herself. "About 20 minutes ago. When I saw him, lying there, he was already unconscious. I checked his wallet and called the number on the card. I didn't know who anyone was." She repeated herself like it was a defense, though she knew it would not matter. Vincent did not react for several seconds. Then he stepped closer, so close she had to tilt her head back to take in his face. His eyes felt like they stripped everything bare. "You did not take the money." It was not a question, simply something he needed, confirmed. Rachel shook her head. "I only wanted to help. He could barely breathe. I couldn't leave him there to die." Vincent closed his eyes for the briefest moment, just long enough to mask a flicker of emotion, then opened them again. He did not thank her, did not say he believed her. He simply turned to his aide and spoke one short command. "Record her name, Rachel Moore." She heard her name repeated by his aide, spoken as if being entered into a file. Nothing more. And in that instant she understood. He forgot nothing, forgave nothing, but he also overlooked no one who had saved his son's life. Not even an anonymous diner, waitress from a small corner of Brooklyn. Rachel stood still, her old canvas shoes soaked through with cold rain, her eyes following the SUV as its rear doors closed on the man she had just saved. None of the men around her rushed. Not a single one showed panic. Every movement was precise, controlled, practiced, as if this was not the first time they had dealt with life and death. She thought that once the vehicle drove away, she could turn her back and leave this place as if nothing had happened. But then Vincent Romano looked at her again, and his gaze was no longer quiet observation but pointed scrutiny. A tall man beside him stepped forward, his expression cold, his hand drifting subtly toward his waistband. Rachel recognized the gesture instantly. It was the reflex of someone carrying a gun. She did not have time to react before Vincent lifted a hand. The man stopped at once, without a word. Rachel felt her heartbeat pounding hard against her ribs, not from the cold but from the realization that she was standing at the very edge of life and death. Vincent stepped closer, close enough that the scent of sandalwood and faint smoke clinging to his expensive coat overwhelmed the damp, musty smell of the alley. His voice dropped lower, not angry, but as cold as carved ice. "You found him, called me, and then stayed with him until I arrived. You expect me to believe that was nothing more than the kindness of a stranger in Brooklyn on a rainy night." Rachel swallowed. "I know it sounds naive, but it is the truth. I did not know who he was. I just saw someone who needed help. I could not walk away." Vincent said nothing. A long silence stretched between them, a silence so heavy it seemed to stop time. Only the rain and the distant fading sound of the departing SUV broke it. Then he spoke. Slowly, each word measured. "In this place, people sell one, another out for pocket change. A stranger unconscious with a wallet full of cash, a watch worth several $1,000s. You are a diner waitress who lives off tips, walking home near 3 in the morning, and you did not take anything, only called the number on a black card. You understand why I cannot simply take your word." Rachel nodded. "Yes, I understand, but I do not need you to believe me. I only know I could not let him die like that." Vincent's eyes stayed locked on her, searching for the slightest sign of deception. Then suddenly, he stepped back and shifted his gaze to the bodyguard beside him. "Take her home, record her address, her name, her workplace. Watch her, but do not interfere. If anything seems out of place, I want to know first." Rachel barely had time to react before the man beside him nodded. Vincent looked at her one last time, his eyes memorizing every detail of her face. He did not thank her. He did not apologize for doubting her. He simply turned, climbed, into the vehicle, and the door closed behind him with a soft, decisive sound. The car pulled out of the alley and slipped into the night. Only Rachel remained, standing alone in the rain, exhaling the breath she had not realized she was holding. She did not know what had just happened, nor what danger she had narrowly brushed past, but she knew one thing with absolute certainty. From this night on, her life would not return to normal. And the name Nicholas Romano would be the last name she should ever speak aloud in any story she told. Yet somewhere deep inside, she knew this was only the beginning. 3 days passed since that cold, rainy night, yet Rachel still could not sleep through a single one. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the gray, piercing gaze of Vincent Romano, sharp, heavy, as if he had carved her name into a list she had never asked to be placed on. She still worked at Marty's diner, still poured coffee, wiped tables, counted change, offered weak smiles to the regulars. But something had shifted, something she could not name, only feel in the way her heart tightened every time the door opened, in the way she glanced toward the street whenever a luxury car slowed near the diner. She told no one, not because of fear, but because no one would believe it. Who would believe a diner waitress met a Mafia kingpin's son lying half dead in an alley, saved his life, and was spared only because she did not steal his money? She kept it to herself, like a deep cut that did not bleed, but throbbed whenever touched. On Wednesday morning, the sky finally cleared after days of rain. Rachel was wiping table 6 when Janet, the morning shift waitress, rushed in, breathless with excitement. "Rachel, someone's waiting for you at table 12. And good Lord, you should see the car he drove, worth more than my entire life." Rachel froze. She turned her head, scanning the row of booths at the back of the diner. At table 12 sat a man, straight-backed, holding a coffee cup with the ease of someone who belonged in far more polished places than this. His dark hair was neatly combed, his charcoal gray suit fitting his frame with quiet elegance. But it was his eyes that made Rachel stop. She had seen them before, when he lay unconscious in the rain, and now, open and focused, they carried a warmth she had not expected. Rachel walked toward the table slowly, each step heavier than the last. When she reached him, the man stood, a faint smile touching his lips. Rachel Moore. His voice was deep, smooth, touched with the cadence of someone who had studied in places far from Brooklyn. She stopped, still unsure whether she was imagining him. I am Nicholas Romano. The man you saved," he said, his gaze never leaving hers. "I need to speak with you." She glanced around and caught Janet pretending to wipe the counter while staring unabashedly. "I'm working." "I already spoke to your manager," he replied, as if the matter took him no more than 5 seconds. "You have a 15-minute break. I only need 5. Rachel said nothing and quietly took the seat across from him. They sat in silence for a moment, the clatter of plates and low diner chatter fading into the background. Nick placed a white envelope on the table and nudged it toward her. She stared at it as if it were something dangerous. "I don't want money." "I know," he said immediately, his voice free of pressure. "This is not payment for silence. It is gratitude. You did not leave me. You did not know who I was. And you still saved me. That, in my world, almost never happens." Rachel kept her hands folded, refusing to touch the envelope. "I didn't do it for a reward. I did it because you were dying, and I couldn't watch someone die and walk away." Nick watched her carefully, nodded once, then spoke more slowly. "Then consider this an invitation. Let me thank you properly. A lunch, a moment of peace, nothing more." Rachel opened her mouth to refuse, but then she saw something. In his eyes, not just gratitude, but something fragile, honest, unlike anyone she had imagined from Vincent Romano's world, and she realized that perhaps she needed an explanation of her own. Not because of who he was, but because of who she had become after that night, because of the questions that had haunted her for 3 sleepless days. She nodded gently. 5 minutes, no more. Nick smiled, a quiet smile that softened the air between them. 5 minutes, he agreed, but both of them knew that whatever began here would not end easily. Rachel did not fully understand why she agreed. Perhaps it was curiosity, or perhaps it was the way Nicholas Romano looked at her, so unlike the way wealthy men usually looked at waitresses in an old diner in Brooklyn. He did not look at her as if she were something unusual, and he did not look at her as if she owed him anything. His gaze was simply an honest invitation, without pressure, without hidden traps, and somehow that made her feel safer than anything else. When her break began, Rachel removed her apron, smoothed her still damp hair from the morning drizzle, and stepped outside. The car waiting for them was a sleek black sedan, polished enough to mirror the entire block behind it. She hesitated for a moment, but Nick had already opened the door before she could refuse. His hand extended as though he had done this 1,000 times, but his eyes held a question, not an order. She stepped into the car, and the door closed with a soft sound, shutting out the noise of the street. They did not drive far. A small Italian restaurant in Carroll Gardens, with white tablecloths and candles made of real wax, waited quietly for them. It was nothing like the ostentation she imagined from someone of his world. When they sat, Nick ordered in Italian, not boastful, not showing off. Rachel did not understand most of it, but the respectful bow from the waiter told her enough. When they were finally alone, something in the air shifted. No, more tension of an rescuer and rescued, no suffocating heaviness like when Don Romano's gaze pressed the breath from her lungs. Nick leaned back slightly, his hands laced together. "You still look uncomfortable." She met his eyes, her voice direct. "I am not used to meals like this, and I am definitely not used to being invited to lunch by someone from the Romano family." He smiled softly, his eyes gentle. "I understand, but forget my name for a moment. Just think of me as the man you saved on a rainy night. No family, no shadows behind me." She was quiet for several seconds. "Fine, once. Then the man I saved. What is his name besides Nicholas Romano?" He tilted his head, as though she had struck a sensitive spot. "Call me Nick. Everyone close to me does." She nodded. "I am Rachel. But I suppose you already know that." "I do," he admitted. "I also know you live alone, walk home every night, and have a cat named Pepper." Rachel leaned back, her wariness returning. "You are watching me." "I am. Protecting you," Nick corrected gently. "Do you know what happened to me? I was poisoned. Someone tried to kill me, and if you had not found me when you did, I would not be sitting here. I cannot let you become the next target." His words thickened the air around them. She stared at him, and for the first time, she sensed the weight he carried beneath his elegant exterior. Before she could answer, their food arrived. The aroma of ragu and toasted bread softened the tension. Nick lifted his glass. "Once again, thank you, Rachel. Not only for my life, but for reminding me that in a world where everything is calculated and traded, kindness still exists." Rachel did not speak. She simply raised her glass and touched his lightly. The clear sound chimed between them in the gentle midday light, like a fragile promise between two people from opposite worlds. After lunch, Rachel returned to the diner with a strange feeling she could not name. Everything looked the same. The familiar smell of grease, the clinking dishes, the regulars in their usual seats, Janet sighing every time she had to serve table 8. But Rachel was no longer the same. She felt as though she had stepped into another world, and coming back made everything familiar feel oddly distant. The following days passed under a blanket of silence. Nick did not contact her, did not send messages, did not appear at the diner. Rachel assumed he had kept his word, thanked her, and disappeared. She tried to slip back into her old routine, but the sense of being watched lingered like a shadow. At first it was subtle. A car parked across the street she had never seen before. The driver slumped against the wheel as though asleep, yet unmoving for nearly an hour. A man who came into the diner 2 days in a row, ordering only a black coffee he never touched, staring out the window until the moment she noticed him, then leaving in silence. Footsteps behind her at night, though every time she looked back, the sidewalk was empty. The hallway lights in her building flickered more than usual. A bulb loosened as if someone had stood beneath it just moments before she walked in. Rachel told no one. She had learned one thing from that rainy night. Sometimes speaking aloud does not make things safer. She began changing her route home, sometimes walking an extra few blocks before looping back, just to be sure no one followed. But the unease never left. One evening, as Rachel cleared tables after closing, Janet glanced out the window, then turned to her with a whisper edged with concern. "Rachel, do you know that man?" Rachel looked up. Through the glass, she saw a figure standing across the street. A long gray coat, hood pulled low over his face. He did not move. He did not shift his weight. He simply stood there with his hands in his pockets, as though waiting for someone. Rachel's stomach tightened. She did not respond. A part of her wanted to believe it was coincidence, a passerby, a homeless man avoiding the wind, but instinct told her otherwise. When she finally turned away, his gaze met hers through the glass, cold, hollow, empty. And then he walked off toward the alleyway at the end of the block and vanished into the darkness. That night, Rachel could not sleep. Every sound in her small apartment made her flinch. She locked the door twice, wedged a chair beneath the handle like she had seen in movies. But what frightened her was not what she could hear. It was what she could not. The sense that someone was waiting for the exact moment she stopped paying attention. In the dark, she thought of Nick, of what he said that day, that he had been poisoned, and that she might be the next target. She had assumed he was being overly cautious, overly protective. But now, when every step outside her door made her blood run cold, she realized he had not exaggerated. She had been pulled into a game where she did not know the rules, where she had no allies, where mistakes could end lives. And whoever was watching her, they were not doing it for amusement. Rachel did not remember what time she left the diner that night. Only that Brooklyn felt emptier and colder than usual. The wind scraped through the low buildings, stirring dried leaves that rattled at her feet like they were running from something too. She tightened her collar, her eyes scanning her surroundings with the instinct she had developed since that night. She had changed her route again, avoiding quiet streets, sticking to brightly lit corners and traffic cameras. But tonight it did not help. She knew she was being followed. The sensation was sharp and undeniable, like a needle pressed to the back of her neck. She walked faster, her shoes tapping harshly against the pavement. When she turned onto the street beside her building, a low laugh rose behind her, steady and cruel. She spun around. 3 men stood at the mouth of the alley. None of them spoke at first. The one in the middle, large, wearing an old leather jacket, with a scar carving down from his ear to his neck, stepped forward. He smiled. "You are Rachel Moore, right? You are famous." She did not answer, instinctively backing away, but the other 2 had already moved behind her. One reached toward his jacket, where anyone in Brooklyn knew a knife or gun could be hidden. She gripped her bag tightly, eyes searching for an escape. "You do not have to be scared, sweetheart," the scarred man said, as if talking to a friend. "We just want to ask a few things. About your handsome friend, Nick Romano. You met him, right? Maybe more than met." Rachel bit her lip, refusing to respond. He laughed again. "You know, people like you, the ones who live on tips and luck, they do not last long once they get tangled with the wrong man. Now you have 2 choices. Tell us what you know." Or he did not finish. Tires screeched at the end of the street. Headlights cut across the men's faces, making them recoil instinctively. The first car braked hard in the middle of the road, and the door flew open. Rachel only understood who it was when the light struck his face. Nick Romano. The calm she saw at lunch was gone. His eyes were sharp as blades, his jaw clenched, and his voice rang out through the dark like a command carved in iron. "Step away from her." The men hesitated for a single heartbeat. Then the tall one whipped a knife from his sleeve, turning toward Rachel. He never got a chance to move. 2 men from the second car rushed forward like shadows. One strike sent the knife clattering across the pavement. Another punch dropped him onto the curb. The remaining 2 were slammed to the ground before they could run, their faces pressed against the cold brick. Rachel stood frozen, her heart bursting against her ribs. Nick approached her, saying nothing at first, his eyes searching her for cuts, bruises, any trace of harm. She was still shaking when he placed a hand on her shoulder, warm and steady. "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, speechless. Nick turned toward the man pinned to the ground. "Tell Malkov that if he touches her again, I will not warn him twice. Next time, I will come myself." One of Nick's men took out his phone, making a call, switching between Russian and English. Nick guided Rachel to the car and opened the door for her as if this were nothing more than an ordinary evening out. She stepped inside without protest, without questions. She did not need explanations. Everything that had just happened spoke clearly enough. As the car pulled away from the empty street, Rachel looked at Nick. His eyes were fixed on the road ahead, but his hand rested gently on hers, a subtle pressure that told her one simple truth. From now on, she was no longer alone. But she also understood, with painful clarity, that this was not an ending. This was the second time he had saved her. And a third time might not come soon enough if she did not understand exactly what she was now caught up in. The car carrying Rachel and Nick left the neighborhood as swiftly as it had appeared, speeding past rows of sleeping buildings lit by the fractured gold glow of late-night Brooklyn streetlights. Inside the quiet cabin, the only sounds were Rachel's uneven breathing, and Nick's hand still wrapped around hers, steady and warm, refusing to let go for even a second. Not until the car merged onto the highway and the city lights began to fade behind them did Nick finally speak, his voice low and certain. "They wanted to scare you, or force you to say something you do not even know." Rachel turned toward him, her eyes still wide with shock. "I do not understand. Why me? I have nothing to do with—" She stopped, unable to say the word Mafia. Nick glanced at her, the corner of his mouth tightening, though not in a smile. "Because you were the last person with me before I lost consciousness, and because you called the right number. Not the police, not the hospital. You called my father. You kept me from dying, and that made you a target." Rachel swallowed, her voice trembling. "So, it was real? Someone actually poisoned you?" Nick nodded, his gaze drifting out the window to the heavy, clouded night sky. "Not an accident, not alcohol. A slow-acting toxin, designed to knock me out gradually. Not enough to kill quickly, just enough to keep me from defending myself, from calling anyone." Rachel tightened her hold on his hand. "Who would do that? Who wants to hurt you?" One name alone chilled her: Victor Malkoff, the same name she had heard on the lips of the men who followed her. Nick was silent a long moment before answering. "That is what I am trying to find out, but it is not simple. The person who carried out the attack might belong to Malkoff. But the person who got close enough to slip something into my drink, that person is inside the Romano family." Rachel stared at him in disbelief. "You mean, the traitor is one of your own?" Nick nodded again. "Or someone who used to be. Very few people have access to my glass. During closed meetings, a handful of trusted advisors, a few family members, all tightly monitored. It could only have been someone my father or I trusted completely." A shiver ran down Rachel's spine. A strike from within. Nick's slow nod held a weight that seemed to darken the entire car. "My father is still investigating, but time is not on our side. Malkoff is slowly taking over the eastern districts. If word of the poisoning spreads, our partners will start to panic. Trust in the family will fracture, and blood will spill." Rachel whispered, barely audible. "So that night when I called your father, I didn't just save your life. I saved some fragile balance from collapsing." Nick squeezed her hand gently, his eyes softening for the first time in days. "You have no idea what you did, Rachel. If I had stayed there for another hour, everything would have ended. Not just for me, but for the Romano family." Rachel turned away, her mind spinning with dark possibilities. She was just a poor waitress, with nothing but nearly worn-out shoes and a shabby apartment. Yet with one call, she had stepped straight into the center of an underground storm. Nick watched her for a long moment before speaking gently. "I cannot let you fall deeper into this, but I also cannot leave you unprotected. You have seen too much, learned too much. Now you are a target not only for Malkoff but for anyone who might exploit you to get to me." Rachel pressed her lips together, her gaze steady even through the fear. "Then do not leave me on the sidelines. Tell me what is really happening." Nick stared at her, surprised by the resolve in her voice. Then slowly, with an expression that held unexpected respect, he nodded. "I will tell you everything, but you need to be prepared. From this moment on, you cannot return to who you were. Everything is going to change." Rachel held his hand tighter. "Everything changed the moment I made that call." The penthouse where Rachel was temporarily taken sat on the top, a floor of a modern building overlooking the Hudson River, with the distant lights of the city glittering like a living painting across the darkness. From up here, New York looked strangely peaceful, as if violence, schemes, and the shadowed underworld she had been pulled into did not exist at all. Everything inside was foreign to her old life. High ceilings, floor-to-ceiling windows, cloud-soft rugs beneath her feet, and expensive abstract art hung on pristine white walls. Rachel moved slowly through each room, afraid to touch anything, as if the furniture could somehow tell she did not belong. Nick did not stay that night. He had to return to the Romano estate for a closed-door council meeting, Rachel understood, but she could not hide the ache of loneliness that filled the vast, silent space once he left. A reserved, middle-aged woman named Angela tended to her needs, polite, discreet, never asking questions. Meals appeared on time, security was exhaustive, and the elevator operated only with the fingerprint already registered for Rachel. She could not leave. She was being held not harshly, but undeniably either as a protected witness or a gentle hostage. That first night, Rachel lay in the white feather-covered bed and could not sleep at all. Every small noise startled her, the wind rattling the windows, the hum of the air conditioning, even the faint taps from the hallway. She imagined the men who followed her standing just outside the door, imagined Victor Malkoff planning a new way to reach her. When she closed her eyes, she saw Nick lying unconscious in the rain. She saw Don Romano's cold gaze, heard his voice, sharp as a blade. "If I hear your name again, there will be nothing left to identify." The nights after were no better. She woke repeatedly, her heart pounding, unsure whether it was nightmares or the suffocating truth closing in around her. One night, unable to endure it any longer, Rachel walked to the balcony. The wind tore at her hair, freezing against her skin like hands gripping her between two worlds, and she wept, the first tears she had shed since that fateful night, not because she was afraid, but because she no longer knew who she was. She was no longer the poor waitress in Brooklyn, yet she did not know whether she could belong to the world Nick lived in either. The next morning, Nick returned. He entered quietly, exhaustion etched across his face, his shirt still carrying the faint scent of smoke and tension. Rachel stood at the counter making coffee, and when she looked up at him, their eyes met with the understanding that something between them could no longer be easily undone. Nick stepped closer and placed a hand on her shoulder, his gaze gentling. "I am sorry for leaving you alone so long." She shook her head lightly. She knew he had no other choice. Nick told her the internal investigation was intensifying, but no one dared name the traitor yet. His father had become more suspicious than ever, every meeting recorded, every family member monitored. In that world, a single mistake could cost a life. Rachel stared into her steaming cup, her voice soft. "And what about me, Nick? Am I a danger to you?" Nick did not answer right away. He looked at her for a long moment before whispering, "You are the only thing that makes me want to walk away from this life. And because of that, you are the weakness any enemy of mine would exploit first." Rachel did not know whether to be terrified or moved, but she knew one thing: whatever lay ahead would not be peaceful. And in that cold penthouse, something fragile and fierce began to take shape between them, a small flame trembling in the heart of a gathering storm. That night, after a simple dinner of Italian pasta Nick had cooked himself, Rachel and he sat on the living room floor, the soft light spilling from the kitchen, painting their faces in gentle lines, as if the dangers outside had paused for a brief, fragile moment. She rested her head on his shoulder while Nick held a glass of wine that shimmered under the muted glow, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the window. He stayed silent for a long time before speaking, his voice low and steady, as if recounting a story that belonged to someone else entirely. He had grown up in that mansion, he said, a place where everything was guarded, where every corner had ears, and where every person hired inside knew how to hold their tongue better than they held onto greetings. When he was young, his mother was still alive. She was the only softness in the house, the only one with a gentle gaze and arms that knew how to embrace. Every night, she told him stories, not fairy tales, but stories about hope, about choices, about kindness. Rachel listened without interrupting, as though each word he spoke needed to be remembered. When she died, Nick continued, everything changed. The house grew colder, not because the heating stopped working, but because warmth no longer lived there. His father didn't cry. He simply watched the casket lower and then returned to a meeting with his advisors, as if grief was something he had outgrown. From then on, Nick learned that tears were a luxury in this world. He was 13 the first time he saw a man taken away and never brought back. It was Uncle Sal, the one who had taught him to play chess and told him stories about his father's youth. A week after the man was taken for speaking out of turn, every trace of him disappeared from the mansion, and no one spoke his name again. When Nick asked his father why, the only answer he received was, "Anyone in this family must guard their words the way they guard their life." Rachel shuddered. She couldn't imagine a childhood smothered by deathly silence like that. Nick gave a thin smile. People assume being born into power is a blessing. They have no idea the price. Every day, he learned not just math and literature, but how to read a man's face, how to hold another's, gaze long enough to catch a lie, how to bury fear, how to give orders. By 15, he was sitting in closed-door meetings, listening to promises spoken in languages that never reached paper. At 18, he saw his father decide the fate of a man he once called brother. That was when Nick understood that loyalty in his world was not measured by years, but by the ability to stay silent until death. Rachel squeezed his hand. So why stay? Because you had no choice, didn't you? Nick shook his head, his eyes softening in a way she had never seen before. There is always a choice. But when you are born in a golden cage, the first choice you learn is how to live with it, and the second is finding someone who gives you a reason to break it. He paused, set down his glass, and brushed his fingers gently along her cheek. You gave me that reason. Before you, I never considered walking away. Not because I loved power, but because I didn't believe I could live differently. Now I believe it, but it scares me. Rachel leaned her forehead against his. I'm scared too, but I'm not scared of you. Nick let out a soft laugh, a rare sound carrying more emotion than any confession. For a moment, all his cold armor cracked, revealing a heart untouched for far too long. And in that room, two people from two different worlds sat side by side, facing a future that could either be a cliff or a beginning neither had dared dream. The phone rang just before 3 a.m, slicing through the quiet of the penthouse and jerking Rachel awake. Nick was still on the balcony, and the glow of his phone lit up the tension etched into his face as he answered. Rachel moved toward him, a knot of instinctive dread tightening in her chest. Nick listened only a few seconds before his voice dropped, low and controlled. Send me the recording. I'm on my way. He hung up, stood, and his eyes darkened as though the Hudson's cold wind had seeped into them. What happened? Rachel asked, her heart pounding at the look on his face. He met her gaze briefly and nodded. We have a name. Rachel frowned. Who? Nick reached for his coat as his phone buzzed again, this time showing a message. An audio file and a short line of text. Tony Recchi. Back meeting room at Club Vesuvio, 212 A.M. No doubt. Nick opened the recording, turned the volume low. A deep, hoarse voice spilled out beneath static and clinking glasses. Malkoff wants him gone. I did my part, made sure the dose doesn't kill right away, just knocks him out for a few hours. The rest is up to you. Rachel had never heard the voice before, but Nick had. He froze, his entire body going still. Tony, he said, repeating the name with a bitterness that scraped at his voice. He held me when I was little, taught me boxing, taught me how to tie a tie, and he poisoned me. Rachel tightened her hand around his arm. Are you sure? It could be edited. It could be fake. Nick shook his head, eyes locked on the screen. His voice, his inflection, the nickname he uses for my father. There's no mistake. He turned to Rachel, his expression wavering as though he was holding himself together by force. This is not just betrayal. This is a blade straight to the heart of my family. Rachel wanted to hold him, to tell him he wasn't alone, but she knew words right now would crack something delicate inside him. Nick called Don Romano, the exchange brisk and icy. We have proof. I'm bringing it in. On the other end, only one sentence replied. Clean it up. Nick hung up, then turned back to Rachel. I have to go. I'm going with you, she said immediately. No, he objected, but she met his eyes unflinchingly. You told me that if I want to be with you, I need to know all of it. I've seen your heart. Now I need to see everything else. Nick exhaled, long and heavy, then nodded. They left the penthouse before dawn. On the drive to the Romano estate, neither spoke. Both understood this confrontation wasn't merely unmasking a traitor. It was a purge among men who once called each other family. And after tonight, nothing would remain the same. The heavy steel door to the basement creaked open, its sound cold and metallic, the kind that signaled a ritual no one wished to witness. Rachel followed Nick down the steps, her palms slick with sweat despite the freezing air that felt like it could crystallize her breath. Yellow light flickered weakly, revealing men standing in a circle around a single metal chair placed at the center of the room, where a middle-aged man was strapped down with leather belts, head slumped low, streaks of gray tangled with sweat and dried blood. Tony Recchi, the man once called uncle by the Romano family, now little more than a broken body awaiting judgment. Don Romano stood at the front, calm and composed, as though preparing for a business negotiation rather than addressing treason. Marco stood beside him, along with several familiar faces Rachel had seen around the mansion. Every gaze shifted to Nick as he entered, not because he was the victim, but because he was the heir, the one standing at the line between emotion and duty. Don Romano signaled, and two men hoisted Tony upright. He slowly raised his head, eyes bruised and glassy under the flickering light. When he saw Nick, he let out a twisted smile, pained but unapologetic. "Hey, kid," Tony rasped. "You made it. Good." No one returned the greeting. Nick silently brought up the audio file, letting it play aloud. The room went dead still, except for Tony's own voice echoing back at him, a confession laid bare on cold cement. When it ended, no one spoke. No one needed to. The truth stained the room like blood already pooling on the floor. Don Romano stepped forward. Why? His voice wasn't raised, yet it sliced through every man's spine. Tony laughed, though bitterness shadowed his eyes. "Because you can't see anymore, Don. Malkov doesn't need to kill you. He just needs you to grow old and blind to the world changing around you. I chose the side that will survive." Don Romano nodded slowly, disappointment far heavier than rage. 17 years. You ate at my table. You protected my son. You guarded my home. 17 years, and you betray us with a single dose. Tony shrugged, his tone chillingly calm. "I didn't kill him. I only helped him sleep a little longer. If he hadn't woken up, maybe it would have saved him from inheriting a kingdom already rotten." Rachel felt Nick's hand clench, but he remained silent, his stillness heavier than an outburst. Don Romano looked at his son. "Your decision." Nick stepped forward, his voice steady, his eyes no longer conflicted. "You were one of my best memories, but you destroyed all of it yourself. And in this family, betrayal doesn't get a second chance." Marco moved without instruction. He nodded once. 2 men stepped up. Tony didn't resist. When the gunshot echoed, Rachel shut her eyes, her whole body trembling. No one spoke afterward. Tony slumped forward, blood tracing a slow path across the cold concrete. Rachel felt her lungs tighten, not from fear, but from witnessing the stark brutality of the world Nick belonged to. And for the first time, she understood she was walking deeper into a path with no exits, where goodness alone could not save anyone. As they left the basement, Rachel gripped Nick's hand. His was ice cold, but his hold was firm. Neither said a word, but in their heavy steps, something had become painfully clear. From this moment on, Rachel was no longer standing outside his world. She had chosen to stay, and the cost of that choice was only beginning to reveal itself. Rachel sat in silence beside Nick on the drive back to the penthouse, her heart still pounding from everything she had witnessed. She stared out the window as the streetlights smeared themselves across the glass, casting alternating bands of brightness and shadow over her face, like the reflection of two worlds she now found herself trapped between. Part of her wanted to scream, to run, to claw her way back to the little diner, to the familiar rhythm of greasy plates and predictable worries. But another part, quieter, deeper, knew she had stepped into a game with no exit. Nick wasn't speaking, his hand still holding hers gently, but she could feel the tension coiled tight beneath his skin. She knew that this time, unlike before, he couldn't simply protect her from afar, couldn't keep her safe by keeping her outside. When they entered the penthouse, Nick closed the door behind them and let his gaze settle on her, heavy with thought. "You need to understand something," he said, his voice low and steady. "From now on, you can't go back to the life you had." She swallowed hard, trying to steady herself. "Why not?" Nick walked through the living room, opened the Dasta liquor cabinet, poured 2 glasses of whiskey, and set one in front of her. Standing close, his eyes fixed on hers. "You've seen what this world really is. You saw betrayal, cruelty, and how my family deals with disloyalty. Now you're part of it, whether you want to be or not." Rachel took the glass with trembling fingers. The warmth of the whiskey soothed her throat, but did nothing to calm the sense of being cornered. "You can choose not to go deeper," Nick continued, "but that won't keep you safe. Anyone who knows you were there, who knows what you saw, is a threat. If you want to live, You have to stand within the circle." She stared at him, wide-eyed, unable to speak. She wanted to fight back, to insist she didn't belong here, that she was just a waitress from Brooklyn. But when she looked into his eyes, Rachel saw the truth. The choice she thought she had was nothing more than an illusion. Nick stepped closer, placing a firm but gentle hand on her shoulder, the weight of his touch grounding his words. "I'll protect you," he said quietly, "but I can't eliminate the danger. You have to decide stay on the outside and become a target, or accept what this is and learn how to survive it without losing who you are." Rachel drew a long breath and looked out the wide window, the city lights glowing like scattered stars below the darkness, then turned back to him. She understood there was no turning back. She had crossed into a world where one mistake could cost her life. And despite her fear, despite the rush in her chest that felt like a trapped bird, she felt something unfurling inside her, a tremor of courage drawn from the trust Nick placed in her, a kind of faith she had never received from anyone before. She inhaled slowly, letting her voice break just slightly as she spoke. "I'll stay." Nick's expression softened at the edges, a faint smile touching his lips though his eyes remained solemn. "Good. But remember, every choice now has consequences. There's no room for fear or hesitation." Rachel felt the full weight of those words sink into her, a blend of terror and new strength washing through her. Her life had shifted, and she knew she was no longer the diner waitress Rachel Moore of Brooklyn. She had become part of the underworld, a place where love, trust, and survival were measured by courage and clarity. And when she spoke those words, agreeing to stay, an uncanny stillness settled over the penthouse. New York still shimmered below them like a vast net of light, but inside the room, time seemed to slow. Nick sat beside her on the couch, the distance between them narrowing to a breath, the warmth of his body bleeding through his shirt and into her. "I never wanted you to live like this," he murmured, barely louder than a sigh. "No one should have to sleep with one eye open." Rachel pressed her lips together. "But it's your world." Nick shook his head slowly. "It's the world my father built, not mine." The words struck her deeply. For the first time, she saw Nick not as an heir, not as a strategist hardened by danger, not even as a man holding himself together under generations of duty. She saw someone desperate for freedom. "I've wanted to leave for a long time," Nick admitted. "Since my mother died, since Uncle Sal disappeared, since I realized that loyalty in this family cuts both ways." He gently touched her wrist, as if asking permission rather than claiming possession. "But I never had a reason to walk out of that golden cage. Nothing to walk toward." His gaze held hers, steady and tender all at once. "Until you." Rachel's breath caught. "Nick, I'm serious," he said, cutting her off softly. "I want a different life. One where I choose who I become, not the shadow passed down from father to son." He stood, pacing slowly around the room, like he was searching for the right shape of the truth he'd been carrying. "Alone. My father will never allow it. He was born in this world, shaped by it, crowned by it. To him, leaving the family is betrayal. This world is all he knows." Nick turned back to her and sank to one knee, the same way he had bowed to vulnerability the night he spoke of his loneliness. "But you don't belong to that world. You don't owe blood to anyone. You aren't bound by rules or power. You're free, and you make me want to be free." The air thickened around her, her heart beat loud enough she feared he could hear it. "What do you want?" she whispered. Nick took her hands. "To leave New York, to leave all of this, to start over somewhere quiet, a small town somewhere no one knows our names. I have enough money for both of us to live comfortably. I could open a garage, a cafe, anything untouched by darkness. And you could live the life you deserve." His voice brimmed with hope. But Rachel's eyes flashed with a different truth. "Your father won't. Let us go." Nick froze, then nodded. "No, it won't be easy. It might be dangerous. But I've been planning this for years. I have an exit route, loyal people outside the city, a 3-step plan to disappear." Rachel blinked in disbelief. "Why tell me all this now?" Nick looked straight into her, his voice quiet but unshakable. "Because if you say no, I'll still get you out safely, but I'll stay behind. And if you say yes, we leave together." Tears warmed her cheeks. She had spent her whole life scraping through uncertainty, but never had she faced a choice so vast between love, danger, and the promise of a new beginning. Behind her lay the hard, familiar world she'd always known. Before her stood the most dangerous yet honest man she had ever met. And in between them was a promise that could alter both their fates. When Rachel finally turned back, Nick was still kneeling, waiting for her answer as if his entire life rested on the next breath. She cupped his cheek and whispered like a tremor, "If you go, I'll go with you." Nick closed his eyes, as if hearing the one freedom he had waited for all his life. But Rachel didn't know that her yes also opened a door to violence and reckoning neither of them had foreseen. Because the first person to discover Nick's plan to leave was none other than Victor Malkov. And he was already preparing his strike. Rachel woke in the middle of the night, the faint light from the distant street cutting across the hardwood floor like thin, glinting blades. The phone on the bedside table vibrated, its screen lighting up with a name she didn't recognize, Victor Malkov. She drew a long breath, her heart thudding painfully, knowing instantly this call wasn't made for pleasantries. She hesitated, then answered. Malkov's voice poured through the speaker, low, cold, and sharp enough that even Nick would have acknowledged the weight behind every word. "Rachel Moore, I know you're there." She held the phone, her lips trembling, unable to form a sound. Malkov continued, as if speaking through her to Nick, standing beside her in some invisible way. "My son's boy, Nicholas Romano, made a grave mistake when he allowed you to step into our world, but I'll give you one last chance. Listen carefully. Not a single misstep, not a single word spoken outside. If you do, no one will be able to protect you. You'll disappear in a way even Nick can't undo." A chill shot up Rachel's spine, raising every hair on her body. His voice didn't need theatrics. Every syllable carried lethal weight. She stepped back, her gaze darting toward Nick standing beside her, his face tense but controlled. Malkov pressed on, enunciating each word with surgical precision. "Every person who knows you, who has seen you with Nicholas Romano, is now a potential target. You are a weakness, Rachel Moore. Surviving the other night was luck, but this is your final warning. You won't get a second chance." Rachel said nothing as a suffocating tightness crept up her throat, her blood turning to ice. She knew in this world, Victor Malkov's warnings weren't threats, they were truths already set in motion. Malkov continued, his calm tone carrying devastating force. "Nick Romano can be protected by his family. You cannot. One wrong move, one careless word, intentional or not, and it is over." Rachel swallowed hard, eyes wide, fingers gripping the phone. Only now did she fully grasp that leaving with Nick wasn't a romantic escape, it was the biggest wager of her life. Hesitation meant death. Malkov's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. "Remember this well. This is your last chance to live. I won't call again." The line went dead, leaving a cold, empty ringing in her ear. She stood frozen, the phone still pressed to her hand, her body numb. Nick stepped close, placing a steady, warm hand on her shoulder. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His eyes held both, fear and unwavering resolve. Rachel looked at him as tears slipped down her cheeks, realizing they now stood on the razor-thin line between life and death, between freedom and control. From this moment on, every decision needed to be weighed like fate itself. There was no going back, no standing on the sidelines. She'd stepped too far, and from here on, Nick Romano's world was the one she would have to live in, face, and fight through if she wanted to survive. The only direction left was forward. The large meeting room in the Romano estate held a heavy, suffocating quiet, the crystal chandelier casting shards of light over the polished wooden table where every member of the family now gathered. Rachel stood quietly in the corner, watching, her heart beating with a strange blend of fear and curiosity. Nick sat at the center, shoulders squared, his gaze unwavering as it met his father's. Don Romano stood at the head of the table, embodying a calm so chilling it commanded absolute obedience. The capos, advisors, and extended family members sat along the sides, none daring to move too quickly, each fully aware of the gravity of this meeting. Don Romano began, his voice low and measured, each word dropping like a verdict. "Victor Malkov is expanding his influence. Poisoning my son was only his first step. We cannot afford hesitation." Nick listened, his eyes darkening for a moment with sorrow before hardening with resolve. Standing near him, Rachel could feel the tension filling the room like a rising tide, each breath carefully drawn. Don Romano continued, pointing toward the men gathered. We secure the Eastern Territory. Every partner, every connection must be verified. And internally, we investigate everyone. There will be no tolerance for disloyalty, Nick added gravely. We must determine who still stands with us and who is a threat. What happened with Tony Recchi is not an isolated case. Malkov isn't simply undermining our power, he's planting doubt in the heart of the family itself. Rachel's pulse quickened. She had never been in a room like this where every glance was a calculation, every shift of posture, an unspoken message, where power felt like a living thing hovering over them all. Don Romano nodded, his tone like cold iron. We prepare every contingency. From this moment, any action taken without authorization will be dealt with severely. There is no room for mistakes or sentiment. Nick turned, his gaze flickering to Rachel in a brief but weighted moment, silently reminding her, this was no game. No fantasy, this was a world where one misstep meant blood. Rachel felt the pressure tighten in her chest, yet something inside her steadied. She believed in Nick, this man who stood so firmly in the center of darkness but still tried to shield her from it. The meeting lasted for hours. Every scenario discussed in brutal detail how to contain information, coordinate forces, prevent internal betrayal, and prepare for Malkov's next moves. Rachel drifted toward the window, looking out at the vast city glowing with quiet innocence. But inside her, everything churned with the understanding that innocence was an illusion. When the meeting ended and Don Romano retreated to his private study, Nick placed a firm, steady hand on her shoulder. We're heading into a real war, he said gently but with fire beneath his words. And you'll need to know how to survive in it. Rachel nodded, knowing there was no turning back, no safe harbor. She would walk beside Nick, learn to navigate the harsh and ruthless world he was born into, and stand her ground beside him. And in that moment, she understood something clearly. The storm wasn't coming, it was already here, and it would define not only the fate of the Romano family but the future she and Nick had chosen to risk everything for. That night, the Romano estate lay submerged in a thick, suffocating darkness, broken only by the faint, flickering glow of security lights scattering small patches of brightness across the stone courtyard. Rachel stood on the second-floor balcony, her eyes fixed on the garden below where silhouettes moved silently among the shadows, a creeping unease tightening every muscle in her body. Nick stood behind her, his hand resting on her shoulder, yet even his steady presence couldn't chase away the dread curling around her ribs. A sudden crash erupted from the southern gate as the heavy metal door flew open under brute force, and several masked men charged into the grounds. Police or rescuers, no. Rachel recognized it immediately. These were Victor Malkov's men, the assassins sent to take Nick down and shatter the Romano family's power. She stepped back, heart pounding as if trying to escape her chest, her foot slipping slightly on the damp floor. Nick's voice cut through the panic, sharp and commanding as he signaled the guards and his most trusted men. They were prepared, but the attackers moved faster than expected. A smoke grenade detonated near the staircase, sending thick, white clouds billowing through the air. Rachel inhaled sharply, choking, unable to see anything beyond dark shapes moving through the fog. She heard screams, the mechanical clicks of weapons, the thunder of gunfire ripping through the night, and for a moment it felt as if the entire mansion trembled with each blast. One of the intruders materialized in front of her, a knife gripped in his hand, his eyes burning with violent intent. Rachel gasped and stumbled backward, nearly falling over the balcony rail. Nick lunged forward, grabbing the attacker's wrist and overpowering him with sheer force as he barked orders for the guards to neutralize the others. Rachel stood frozen, her chest tightening, each second stretching into an eternity. She saw Nick moving with swift precision, commanding everyone around him yet never losing sight of her, his gaze tethered to her with fierce vigilance. A gunshot cracked through the chaos near the living room, making Rachel jerk back, tears spilling down her cheeks. Nick rushed to her, pulling her inside and slamming the door shut. His breath was heavy, his voice low and shaking with anger and worry as he asked, "Are you hurt?" She shook her head, unable to speak, her whole body trembling uncontrollably. Nick cast a quick glance through the window, spotting the dark vehicles and figures navigating the courtyard. This was a coordinated assault, not a random strike. He signaled his men again before turning back to her, his voice firm yet gentle. "We'll get out, but you have to trust me." Rachel took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. She knew that whatever life she once had was gone forever, Nick guided her to the basement, where a hidden exit, known only to the Romano family, waited, his eyes never leaving her. They stepped into the narrow passageway, just as the roar of engines and frantic shouting filled the grounds above, the chaos so close she could feel death brushing past her shoulder. Nick pulled her into the waiting car, started the engine, and the sedan sped into the night, leaving behind the echoes of explosions, smoke, and darkness. Rachel felt her whole body trembling, but when she looked at Nick, she saw a strange calm in his eyes, a fierce steadiness that had saved her life once again. And as the car sliced through the darkened roads, she understood with chilling clarity that there was no safe place left in the world for her anymore, only Nick, and the path they had chosen together, where love and survival were forever intertwined with danger and war. As their car left the Romano grounds behind, the air inside the cabin remained taut like a stretched wire. Rachel curled against the seat, gripping Nick's hand, her heartbeat still racing after the brush with death. Nick stayed silent, eyes fixed on the road, but beneath that calm exterior she sensed the storm of thoughts churning through him. Once they reached a temporary safe house, Nick contacted Don Romano through a secure line. Don's voice emerged steady, powerful, carrying a weight that seemed to anchor the room. "Have you completed the task?" Nick answered in a low, clipped tone. "We're safe." The intruders retreated, but this doesn't mean the war is over. A pause followed before Don replied, his voice colder than ice. "I know. But remember, every choice now is yours. What happened tonight was your final test. The responsibility you carry is no longer mine." Nick understood. His father had released control. The fight was now in his hands. He glanced at Rachel, his gaze deep, protective, and unbearably tender. "You saw everything. You know what I'm up against." She pressed her lips together, saying nothing, but her eyes spoke clearly. She was ready to stand beside him, whatever came next. Nick stepped outside, drawing a long breath as he looked over the sprawling city shimmering beneath the night sky, the lights reflecting on the Hudson River like fractured constellations. He knew that from now on, every action, every decision would shape the future of the family and the lives of those he cherished, especially Rachel. Their enemies had retreated for now, but Viktor Malkov's ambition had never cooled. Nick needed to rebuild the defenses, verify every contact, and prepare for the next strike. This was not just a war against an external enemy, but a test of loyalty within their own ranks. Nick returned inside, taking Rachel's hand and squeezing it gently, as though passing his strength to her. "We move forward," he said quietly, "but nothing will ever be simple again." She nodded, fear and determination mingling in her chest. He carried not just a legacy of power, but the weight of keeping those he loved alive. Rachel stepped closer and rested her head against his shoulder, feeling the strain and resolve embedded in his every breath. Together they faced the vast city, wrapped in darkness, knowing Nick would now walk the path without Don Romano beside him, and Rachel felt the tremor of truth. This journey ahead would test them in ways they could scarcely imagine. 6 months later, the peace they now held had been purchased through fire. A brutal, unrelenting war that raged for 30 nights and days after that assault had reduced Malkov's empire to ashes. Nick, with the cold precision inherited from his father and the strategy born from his own mind, had executed the boldest move of his life, using the collapse of his enemy to stage his own death in a meticulously crafted explosion. He handed control of New York's territory to Marco, his most loyal lieutenant, burying the name Nicholas Romano, forever beneath the ruins of the past, to buy his freedom. Now, Rachel and Nick stood on the porch of a small house, nestled in a quiet Oregon town, surrounded by green-covered mountains and winding stone paths, leading to a charming little main street filled with mom and pop shops. There were no blinding lights, no blaring sirens, only the soft call of birds and the whisper of wind through the trees. Rachel exhaled deeply, and for the first time in months, she felt her lungs truly expand, her heart lighter than she ever thought possible. Nick stood beside her, his hand warm on her shoulder, his eyes gentle and unburdened by the weight of power or danger. Life here was simple, peaceful, and free. Each morning they rose early, walked beneath the canopy of trees, sipped coffee at the small cafe near their home, greeting kind neighbors who knew nothing of the shadows they once lived in. Wrapped in her thick sweater, Rachel held her warm cup between her palms, feeling her heartbeat slowly align with this quiet rhythm of life, a stark contrast to the terror-filled nights of New York. Nick told her about his plan to open a small shop, something they could run together, something rooted in choice rather than obligation. Rachel smiled, her eyes sparkling with a joy she hadn't felt in years. They wandered along the lake, watching birds skim the golden surface where the late-day sun painted the water with hues of amber. Rachel tightened her grip on Nick's hand, safety blooming quietly inside her chest. There were no threatening calls now, no lurking shadows, just the two of them in a fragile peace she cherished deeply. Yet the memories of Victor Malkoff, of the Romano mansion, of nights soaked in danger still lived quietly beneath the surface, a reminder that peace was precious because it was never guaranteed. They visited local shops, greeting residents, and when someone asked Rachel where she had lived before, she smiled and sidestepped the details, knowing some truths must remain buried. Nick's gaze lingered on her with tender pride. "We made it this far," he murmured, "and you proved you can live, fight, and love beside me. No one can take that from us." Rachel's heart swelled with a sense of liberation, though she never forgot the choices that brought them here. As they sat by the lake, the sun dipping behind the mountains, Nick spoke softly about the small things: a home, quiet mornings, long walks through town. Rachel listened and realized, perhaps for the first time, that peace could be real. That she and Nick had carved a place where love was no longer a battlefield, no guns, no enemies. Just the two of them, and a world made gentle by their survival. Leaning against his shoulder, she felt warmth and quiet strength surround her. 6 months had passed, and she understood something profound. The past was gone, but the present was theirs to hold fully, tenderly, fearlessly, in a town she could finally call home. And from their story, we learn something essential. To dare to live, to choose, and to protect what we believe in is how we transform the impossible into truth, how we uncover meaning and value in our lives. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to our channel, like, and share so you won't miss the meaningful videos we post each day. We hope to hear your thoughts, your emotions, reflections, and how this story resonates with your own life. Share from the heart. We welcome it all. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next video. Wishing every one of you health, joy, and peace each day. Goodbye for now, and until we meet again in the next story.